So now we would like to welcome Azem, Jalal Azem's son, for the keynote address.
To begin with, on behalf of myself and the Sadiq Jalal Azem Foundation, which I also represent, a foundation that we established to preserve and disseminate Sadiq Jalal Azem's intellectual legacy for future generations, I would like to thank the American University of Beirut, Departments of Philosophy, Sociology, Anthropology, and Media Studies, the Center for Arts, Humanities, and the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies for arranging this conference as a tribute and a long-needed tribute to Sadiq Jalal Azem, his ideas and legacy. In a preamble, I was standing with some of the colleagues here talking, and we said that this is probably going to be the only tribute he gets in the Arab world, considering the times that we live in. Maybe only, maybe possibly in Maghreb, maybe he might get something. I don't think anywhere else will have the courage or the will to do this. I would also like to take the opportunity here to announce that the Sadiq Jalal Azem Foundation, in accordance with Sadiq's wishes, intends to donate to the AUB Library Sadiq's papers, newspaper clippings, and these are all the original documents that are involved with the writing of the Naqd al-Fikr al-Dini and the whole affair associated with it, in addition to his cultural activities, lectures, book reviews, and what was written about his, again, quote-unquote, problem with AUB back in 1967 that various people have mentioned here. And there are also a number of other books and journals that we feel might be appropriate to house here at AUB. These are part of his extensive personal library in Damascus, and we're going to make arrangements to bring those over too.
Thank you.
Now, the thought of giving a full 1 hour, when I hadn't noticed that, I opened the schedule and I was looking at the lecture schedule and I saw that you'd given the keynote 1 hour. I mean, that's deadly. I mean, I was going, oh my God, I have to speak for 1 hour. So I promise you, I'm going to try and avoid doing that. And especially when the keynote is about one's own father. And of course, when I was initially approached for this, it all began with, yes, sure, I can do this, no problem. I should have plenty to say about him, both as a father and as an intellectual. But then, as the process of writing unfolded, I began to realize how complex and layered a person he was, both in his intellectual and public persona, as well as his private one. And then I began to worry. I guarantee you, I assure you, I was worried. On the surface, you know, when you think of Sadiq, you think of this larger-than-life person. He was a very open person, and he was also rarely ever discreet with his opinions, criticisms, as we have heard just now. Even his affairs, and on numerous occasions, these have landed him in hot water, both with the authorities outside, that is the official authorities, and the authorities at home. And there were many of those, I guarantee you, as well. Yet, when it came to the time to define my relationship with my father, Sadiq, based on this open persona that I, like everybody else, thought we knew, I found myself woefully unprepared. So I began this process to sort of try to rediscover this person and maybe redefine him by examining how he shaped and influenced me as his son, my opinions, my intellectual thoughts. And I was hoping that perhaps through that lens I could better understand who Sadiq really was. Now, I'm going to hit a few core areas which I think were not only important for Sadiq, but also then became, in an indirect way, important to me too. Sadiq hails from as you probably many of you know already, a prominent Ottoman family with numerous pashas playing important roles in the Ottoman administration of the Arab provinces. And this is something Sadiq never forgot, despite his Marxist ideologies. I mean, we all think of Sadiq, we think of Sadiq, the Marxist, the left-wing intellectual. But was he really that? In fact, his family origins and roots is something that he often referred to, talked about, and was clearly impacted by as well. And I think I note a similar quality in myself too, so mentally we're checking that box. Moving on to political self-consciousness and awareness of public and international affairs, I believe that the nationalization of the Suez Canal by President Nasser in 1956 and the ensuing Suez Canal War against Nasser's Egypt were also very important and defining moments for Sadiq. I think that the idea of being part of what seemed then like a brave new world in the making appealed to him. And that it was something more ambitious, more fulfilling, and more rewarding than simply pursuing a routine academic career in the United States at one of its many institutions, or even in Europe. And so, as we were told, at the end of his academic studies, he decided to return home where he felt he could make a difference. In other words, he opted against being an active Arab intellectual in exile. He wanted to be where the action was. Yet, it is in exile exactly where he ended after so many years, and at the time of his death. After a brief stint in Damascus, upon his return from the US in 1962, Sadiq would move to Beirut and make it his home and begin teaching at AUB between 63 and 67. 67, 68. These are, we talk about academic sort of years, not actual, January to December years. And for Sadiq, he felt that despite its debilitating faults, Beirut was the only relatively free political and cultural space in the whole Arab world, and thus would begin that very special relationship with Beirut. I don't think it began when he was a student. It began after he came back from the US. To quote Sadiq here, for the Arab 60s generation, my generation, Beirut was both its cultural hub and its indispensable center for public debate and discussion, as well as for a decent margin of free expression and uncensored publishing. To this day, all Arab publishing companies have a foothold in Beirut, and all my writings in Arabic were published in that city. I remain grateful to Lebanon for all that. His most famous books, Naqd al-Dhati ba'd al-Hazima, Self-Criticism After Defeat, and Naqd al-Fikr al-Dini, Criticism of Religious Thought, were both conceived, written, and published here in Beirut, and continue to be banned in every other Arab state to this date. Other controversial books would follow, including his famous defense of Rushdie in the 80s, his famous response to Edward Said's book on Orientalism. Yet this is also an important moment to introduce another critical factor, which was briefly mentioned by Nabil just now, Fawz. None of this could have been achieved without that great influence in his life. His wife, Fawz Toukan, also my mother. To kind of put this into perspective for you, I'm going to tell you a little anecdotal story. Back in 1999, 1 year before my mother passed away, we were all busy in the kitchen at our home in Damascus, myself, my wife Jumana, and he was busy writing one of his pieces, his important pieces. And suddenly he would rush into the kitchen and ask my mother something. And while she was stirring the pot and keeping an eye on something else, just gave him this snap answer like that, which he sort of nods his head and then turns around to walk back to his office to continue writing, then stops, and then turns around to my wife Jumana, who we had only just been married a few months, and says, "This is how books are made in this house." And moving on a little, when the Arab Spring finally reached Syria in March 2011, Sadiq was living here in Beirut. His anti-regime stance and support for the uprising, however, would soon force him to leave his beloved sanctuary, fearing the long reach of the Syrian regime that could easily find him in Beirut. So in August 2011, Sadiq would leave Beirut for the last time to Germany, albeit to honor a contract that he had signed just then with the Institute of Advanced Study in Bonn. But unfortunately, it would also be the last time he would set foot in his beloved Beirut. Nevertheless, the Beirut-Lebanon connection is an enduring and recurring one, particularly when it comes to addressing the thorny question of whether the Syrian conflict is a civil war or not, for example. Sadiq has expressed strong views publicly on the subject by drawing parallels between the Syrian conflict and Lebanon's own civil war. From the very beginning, Sadiq vehemently opposed describing the Syrian conflict as a sectarian or religious one, or even calling it a civil war. He said, in the Lebanese civil war, the state stood by helplessly, while civil communities, religious sects, and factions mobilized against each other and fought the war for 16 years. In Syria, on the other hand, he continues, he says, it is an abuse of the term to call such a conflict a civil war, especially that none of the country's other minorities, religious sects, and civil communities mobilized collectively to defend the regime or fight on its side. Continuing to compare the two conflicts and to reflect on the role of minority sects in this conflict, he says that by the middle of the 1970s of the last century, political Maronitism that had dominated and ruled the country from the start, talking about Lebanon that is, became a minoritarian form of rule. To end the civil war here in Lebanon, the political Maronitism had to go. Similarly, he then says in Syria, to end the bloody conflict there, absolutist political Alawitism had to go as well. For that expression, many Syrians, both regime supporters and secular oppositionists, failed to understand the concept and sharply criticized him. Some even going as far as accusing him of showing his true Sunni sectarian colors. Others were less generous and said he had become senile. Yet what Sadiq was saying, in truth, was that Syria needed a Dayton-like settlement. A settlement that would achieve what the Taif Accords achieved for Lebanon. After the war, Lebanon held together in spite of calls for partition during the war. Its confessional system remained, but with radically changed rules in the game. Similarly, Iraq held together in spite of the civil war, deep internal divisions, and vicious enmities amongst the warring parties. By drawing on these experiences, by drawing on his experiences of the conflict here in Lebanon and of his experiences of the region and of Syria, he expects Syria to hold together also, in spite of current murmurs of partition. However, Sadiq says also what makes it difficult to anticipate outcomes in Syria is the realization that Syria, the old, is now dying and the new is not yet born. He told me his hopes were that Syria's mosaic nature will incline it towards a more inclusive, participatory form of rule. The best case scenario is for a religiously neutral civil form of rule to take shape after a post-Assad anticipated and expected anarchy and violence. So as all this went in my mind and I reflected introspectively, I began to see more clearly how Sadiq's intellectual journey, shortened as it was in this brief narrative that I gave you, had shaped me in ways I had not realized previously. It seems I am more my father's son than I care to admit for so long. I will close now with a direct quote from Sadiq, where he was answering a question about how to summarize himself. In his words, I pursued a career of university teaching, writing and research, basically in Beirut and Damascus. I am proud that I did not permit my academic work and specialization to isolate me in an ivory tower. Throughout my active life, I maintained a keen interest in political developments as well as in our public and cultural affairs. All this is evident in my published writings, both in Arabic and in English, over half a century. Should you ask me for a brief self-description, I would say I am a critical Syrian Arab intellectual, very much on the spot. And thank you. Does that mean we're on cue for the break?
Would you like a Q&A? Yeah, we have time. Okay, so. Okay, I will start something to say that I think we should really study how Sadiq Jalal Azem survived in Damascus University. And this is what I call, we need a post-authoritarian studies or to reflect about, how intellectual may survive in an authoritarian system. And guess what Sadiq taught me in Damascus University? Nobody can guess. He taught me English because in that time he was not allowed to teach regular courses. So the grandiose Sadiq Jalal Azem was allowed to teach English and introductory course in that time and some administrative work.
Yeah, that's correct. I think just a brief comment on that. Sadiq understood, and I think he had an uncanny knack for that, understood exactly where the lines were, and at least as far as the Syrian regime, maybe he didn't understand them as far as AUB was concerned, but certainly as far as the regime was concerned in Damascus, he definitely understood where the lines were, and he would push right up to that boundary until he felt an uncomfortable level of pushback, and then he would sort of stand back again. But he was also aided by one which kind of helped him uniquely where others may not have been helped. And that was that there was a quid pro quo, that the regime also benefited from Sadiq al-Azem too, and his ability to push those boundaries. Because the regime regularly also said to the rest of the Arab world and the world at large, you call me repressive, you call me authoritarian, I am allowing Sadiq al-Azem to live here and say what he pleases. Which of you Arab states and Arab regimes have allowed him to do that? And the answer was zero. Even as at a university level, and even AUB couldn't stomach him, and yet Damascus University somehow contained him.
Actually, I'm Abdul. Actually, he was Abdul.
I'm glad you're here.
Actually, he was not allowed to teach at the Damascus University straight away, because when he went, and they told him, he was a graduate, PhD graduate from Yale. He didn't have the Syrian baccalaureate, so he was not allowed.
That's correct. He did have, in the end, when he went back to teach it was 77, he had to take the baccalaureate and pass that in order to be allowed to teach. And by the way, it's the same thing happened to me. When I went back to Syria, I was also forced to take the same baccalaureate he had to take to be allowed to teach at the university.
Another anecdote to share with you. He had an appointment with Hafiz al-Assad. And as Sadiq is, he went with a red t-shirt. And Hafiz al-Assad refused to receive him because he did not have the dress code.
That's probably why he did it. he was the opt-out clause.
Do you feel also that you are in exile, as your father was in Germany? That's a question.
Yani, at the end of the day, I think I decided to exile myself, long before he ended up in exile. But then we are all exiled in our own little sort of world now, and it is yes. I guess the answer is yes. I am. I too am in exile, but not for the same reasons that he was necessarily exiled. His issue was much different than mine.
Did he ever talk about what he thought about his writing in English or in Arabic, and which one he preferred, and which one may have perhaps had a better or more impact in his own view, or was it all the same to him?
At least not with me. I don't think this was a discussion he ever had personally. I know that obviously his choice of language was very much also dictated by who the audience was intended. So when the audience is intended, and the purpose. So his, for example, Naqd al-Fikr al-Dini and Naqd al-Zati could only be written really in Arabic if they were to have the impact that they did. Whereas perhaps his response, for example, the Orientalism response, that was directed at another audience, so it had to be written in English. I think his style of writing in Arabic is, very kind of straightforward and matter of fact. It lacks that flowery sort of language, which maybe from an adabi style, it's a little dry. I don't know, but his English style is definitely very. Sorry. I meant by dry, maybe what I meant by dry is in the sense it's not your classic traditional sort of style of writing. It's a much more academic kind of highly structured. It's more like somebody in English writing in Arabic than somebody in Arabic writing in English, if you see what I mean.
Can I follow up on this? He invited me to this just after the controversy of my book, co-edited by two anti-Zionist Israelis. So in this dinner, it was Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid also. And he told me, look, we three, we will make the Arab thought progress, and please publish it in Arabic. This is where you steer the debate in etc. And actually, he talked with Center for Arab Unity Studies, and the book was published in Arabic. So he was aware of the importance of conveying the message in Arabic. So you and Una and then Idris. I see the three.
I would kindly appreciate it if you comment on the limits of Sadiq's Marxism with respect to coexisting with the Syrian regime at that time. What kind of Marxism was his, particularly to the effect that you said he was quote-unquote domesticated, or he could exist. This is one thing. Another thing, another question. He was signatory to a manifesto by Damascene intellectuals shortly before the outbreak of the war. Thank you.
Okay, so look, the issue of his Marxism, I mean, I'm sure there are better qualified people to kind of delve into the nuances of all that, but I can tell you, and we were just, it so happened, we were just discussing this this morning, myself and one of our colleagues here, For me, Sadiq was not an ideologue, and I don't think his Marxism was an ideology per se. It was something that he sort of thought about on an intellectual level, but he was never a practitioner of Marxism. So you cannot see him in the classic sense of being somebody who lived and breathed Marxism. And that is probably why, for the regime, he was never really a problem. It was something, that was in his thought. It may have influenced some of his ideas and critiques, but it was never a practitioner thing. That's how I understood it. But as I said, there may be scholars here who have a much better way of explaining it than I just did. And sorry, for the 99, yes, he was a signatory on the Bayan Tisaw Tis'een, which was the first major, one of the cornerstones of the beginning of the latest phase of Rabi' Damascus, Damascus Spring and the post Hafiz al-Assad period. But he wasn't punished for that. The real problems for him came when they did the second Bayan, which was the one that they signed to in support of the withdrawal of Syrian forces from Lebanon. That's the one that caused him the real problems, and continued to do so to the point where in 2009 we advised him not to go back to Syria. And in fact, technically speaking, he stopped going back to Damascus in 2009 and had not set foot in the country since then, and not in 2011 as we generally think of it, along with the Syrian opposition, the Syrian uprising and all that.
Can I comment on this?
Yes.
Sadiq was a special type of thinker. He's not dogmatic. His thinking was dynamic, changing. So, and as Ahmed said, in Damascus, they were happy to have a person like Sadiq there. I had spent some 3 years working with the UNDP as a consultant, going back and forth to Damascus, and I had the pleasure to meet with many Syrian officials. And they used to brag to me that, okay, here we are. We have a person like Saad al-Azem here. So Sadiq, although they were afraid of him, but they were not really that afraid of him to the extent that they would sort of send him out. He was a special type of a thinker.
Are you thinking of recollecting his books, republishing them maybe in volumes with his papers and writings?
Yes,
and perhaps establishing a website where these will be available?
The website is already up there. If you Google our foundation, you will find it. So that is already there. In terms of publishing, certainly we are in the process of looking at both in terms of unpublished works that he may have left lying around, as well as new collections, editions, and we are in discussions with a number of publishers for that. So yes, the answer to your question.
Yes, I'm a postdoc fellow at the UB, and my question is regarding memory and how we remember such figures. And one thing that struck me today, but in the wider discussion, is some people remember this figure, but some people discover this figure anew, and some people will in the future. So my short question is to you and to your foundation, do you see a difference between people who will recollect and commemorate this figure, people who will approach him anew, and how do you yourself want him to be?
Thank you for the question. In my very brief introduction of what the foundation is, which is, by the way, a registered foundation. It's registered in the United States and so on and so forth. The purpose is to preserve and disseminate. So it has a dual purpose: to preserve memory for those of us who remember, and to disseminate for those generations to come. And whilst many of his writings and teachings may be of great interest to the scholars, both in the West and in the Arab world, really the next generation of Arab youth that have not had the experience of being exposed to his writings and to his ideas, these are really our most important target. And these are the ones that we would very much want to engage with, as much as we would also want to make whatever materials available to scholars as well. That is one of the reasons why we're donating his papers to be housed here at AUB, where they would be more accessible to that generation than if I were to house them at my university in Ohio or in some other faraway Western institution.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have many episodes about my relationship with Sadiq and Edward Said, but I can't reveal them all here. But why? Because in fairness, Edward was reacting personally. How a close friend of mine does this to me, you know, and I kept telling Edward, but look, not only Sadiq, but many other scholars have taken you to task on this. But he would say, but Sadiq was my friend. And then the whole idea that a friend can dare to be overcritical. And to his death, Edward, bless his soul, never forgave Sadiq. Now, I did something else.
The same with Ebenezer.
Come here. Yeah, in 1970 or 71, Philip Khoury, the chairman of our board, was one of my students in a seminar I was giving at that time. And then he became chairman of the Middle East Studies Association. And in his address, he singled out me as having the courage to invite Edward to my class and give a 1-hour seminar when the university had dismissed him. And I had to, again Edward says, how do you do this? You never invited me to your class, and you invite, you know, then I did something else at the very end. But I also met Sadiq in Princeton in 1985. I think he was on leave there. And I remember one day he gave me a telephone. He says, you know, Samir, in one day in America, you collect more garbage than 5 years in Syria. He says, somehow, I wake up in the morning, I open my mailbox, all I find is things I throw away. He did something worse, which speaks about somehow, Princeton students invited Amin Ismail to give a talk in Princeton. When Amin Ismail finished his talk, Azem was in the audience. What did he do? He walked on stage, a meter away from Amin Ismail. He told him point blank, why were you labeled Mr. 5%? And again, and then Amin Ismail, afterwards, and he gives you 200. But this is really what Sadiq was. A maverick. He never dared, to be critical of some of his closest friends. Why he was dismissed from AUB, one day I might reveal this, has nothing to do with his writing or his intellectual output. President Khoury is here, and he's been critical of the fact that we did not, it took us so much time to pay tribute to Edward. But initially, but initially, I think his dismissal from AUB had much to do with his personal relationships with the dean at that time than the character of his writing. Thank you.
That's a shame.
Thank you so much, Professor. فضلوا بده يحكي كلمة قبل.
So no, I'm just curious, since we have Ahmed on stage, you know, one of the most controversial things now that in America, and I'm sorry to call it this, but the ivory tower protected liberal left has been consumed in convulsions about the election of Donald Trump. Certainly not someone I voted for, but that's there. And I would have been very curious as to and I am curious what you would have think his reaction would have been to the very searing criticism of the left by a professor at Columbia, which I think he entitled, and I'm looking it up, The Fall of Identity Liberalism. This article that he published in the New York Times after Trump won has now led, rather than to what I think your father would have liked, which is a genuine re-examination, because this is a defeat for the American liberal left that's not different than the defeat for the Arab world in '67. But the reaction in isolating an individual who is a card-carrying liberal somehow as a vermin, as a virus on intellectualism has been disturbing to me. Not dissimilar to what happened to your father, whatever the cause of his dismissal might have been. You're intellectual American. What do you think of this? And what do you think he would have thought?
Remember, I have to go back home.
Yes.
And I'm not a citizen yet. I'm just joking. No, but look, I think I remember briefly having a conversation with my father about Trump. He asked me, he was living in Berlin then. We came over to visit him that summer. This was in August of 2016, and he asked me what I thought about the chances of Trump winning the election, and of course, like any other clear-thinking, intellectual liberal, we just dismissed it and said the guy is a clown, and in fact, the best thing that could have happened to Clinton is the fact that he was going to win the nomination, and that this was going to be a cakewalk. So I think, and he nodded. He didn't seem to think otherwise, and sort of moved on. But I think the great miscalculation. I'm going to quote somebody else. I'm going to come back to you with a slightly different. I'm not a huge fan of Michael Moore, in the sense that I understand what his works are, but I'm not a deep follower of his work, of his thinking and so on. But he made a very, very, very incisive comment for me that kind of framed all of this. He said, when Trump produced those caps, those really garish, ugly caps and they weren't just your, you can do stylish ones. No, these were the most garish possible version of these baseball caps with the Trump Make America Great Again, and started wearing them and walking around in his campaigns. Everybody made fun of him. We all made fun of him publicly. And by meaning all, meaning the intellectual, liberal, left, and the mainstream media and so on and so forth. What we failed to understand then was that by doing so, we were not making fun of Trump, but we were making fun of the uniform of the Americans who dress like this every day, because it is part of their everyday clothing. That is who we were making fun of. And it is that miscalculation that kind of sets us up to where we are today. And if we are going to have that reflective moment, we should begin from that point onwards. And perhaps this is my anthropological background coming out of here. I'm thinking more like an anthropologist. But to me, that was very telling. And partly Michael could see this because he's exactly from that part of the world. He is from that sort of Midwest, where people do dress like this on an everyday level, and it got missed.
Fortunately, they don't color their hair orange. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I'm more concerned about the firestorm around Mark Lilla, who expressed what many of us thought. Look, all of us were saying, I hope he wins the Republican convention because it's going to be a landslide. To our surprise, he didn't win. But the fact that we can't even discuss why he won troubles me, and I think it probably would have troubled him.
And I think we're still unable to articulate.
Thank you so much. 15 minutes coffee break.